Hey you guys, so I'm still feeling a little bit under the weather, but in the spirit of Halloween and the month of October, I'm gonna try and do another one of those stories that I've written. This time I am opting for a shorter story that I wrote about 5 years ago under the pen name Penny Copper. The other one I tried was the first chapter of a really long novel that I'd written, but this one is a little bit shorter, so, you know. Anyway, the point is that you can just relax and decompress and be distracted from the stresses of your workday and just enjoy a story if you can. So this is called Just a Dream, a short story. Nathan Hart stumbled erratically down the hall from his bedroom to the drippy bathroom sink. He lived alone in this place, this old cracker box house in an old suburb at the edge of the San Gabriel Mountains that had barely been looked at, let alone painted or worked on, in several decades. It was one of those neighborhoods that bordered on being urban, but was mostly comprised of retirees with deadbeat children and a few younger families. Although his actual house was surrounded by clear lots filled with bushes and trees, with the nearest neighborhoods 100 yards away. He trudged past all the neglected furnishings of the hallway he had made as he made his way to the sink. The walls were chipped, nails jutted out from their surface, begging for a framed piece of artwork to cling to. It was better than having to deal with his mother, Sandy Hart, and his two prissy younger sisters who occupied the house he grew up in. 3 grown people fighting for control over one another's lives was not his idea of a happy arrangement. It was 1:30, and there was no sign of sleep that night or any night in the near future. He stared at himself in the mirror for a moment, taking in the exhaustion that had marked his young visage. It was mid-September, and the hot summer weather was having one last swing. He splashed water over his sweaty face in the vain hope of cooling his stifling thoughts. That day had been particularly difficult for him. He worked at an accounting firm, and in an effort to keep his clients' finances in order, had all but lost his mind. He was not the most confident person, yet he was expected to assert authority over hysterical people with crumbling resources. He truly felt sorry for a lot of his clients. Most of them were lower middle class, uneducated people, terrified of being audited and not really knowing what that meant. But that did not make them any less obnoxious. In addition to the incompetent clientele, he played confidant to the most bizarre and needy of co-workers. He had spent far too much time listening to other people's problems, allowing them to treat him like a token sidekick whilst he kept his life's troubles stuffed deep inside him, incapable of getting a word in edgewise. "Look at you. You're a total mess," he hissed at himself, as though that would help the situation. Then again, self-deprecation was a staple of his. Not only was his career of the most draining variety, but after 29 years of avoiding the subject altogether, he had just last spring come out to his family as gay. This was especially hard on his mother, even more so on his father, who had divorced his mother several years ago and was more or less detached from his children. Nathan's mother had him when she was just 17 and had all the telltale signs of a parent who wanted to make up for past behavior. She did this chiefly by marrying a stockbroker and buying everyone useless gifts. Recently, she had become the most dominant of personalities in Nathan's life, simply by being the person he had most frequently seen. She did not understand the point of homosexuality. Everyone in his circle seemed shocked by his orientation, which in turn surprised him since he drove a truck, watched too much basketball, knew nothing about fashion trends, and had a whole list of traits that were traditionally considered to be masculine. If he could change his preferences, he certainly would have, but he had reached a point in his life where there was no reason to lie about dating girls and bringing willing friends around the house. It wasn't as though he was never attracted to women. In fact, he had taken quite a liking to them physically, but his life thus far had made he had made significant bonds with a few very special men. A queer accountant, every man's dream. He toweled off the excess moisture from under his chin and his narrow blue eyes touching the skin that hung loosely just beneath their lower lids, and then forced his tired body back to bed, nearly tripping on the various bedside tables he had staggered across the hall. He collected furniture almost compulsively. It wouldn't take him much longer to find sleep, but the feelings of anxiety nagged so persistently at his inner gut that every waking moment was agony. He had been plagued by nightmares in the past month, though he could never remember their detail once he awoke. He only knew that something very stressful was happening in the context of those dreams. "You will get over it, old man. Just give it time." The it he was referring to wasn't the separation from his family, nor the torture of being alone in his community, but the mounting disaster that was his recently finished tax season. All of his clients filed for extensions, and he managed to deal with them well before the October cutoff, though it was no easy feat. He clung on to stressful events in his professional life and went over every detail of their passing, as though he had to prove to himself how competent he actually was. "Just get up tomorrow and go for a run. It will all just melt away. That's what you need. Just some damn exercise, fat boy." He patted his stomach. He was getting kind of fat, there was no denying that. But of all the things that cursed him late at night, his weight was the least of them. He had been one of those unfortunates who could never seem to escape the awkwardness and angst that came with adolescence. One thing he had was his intelligence. He may not have known how to deal with people or their needs, but he had awesomely sharp mathematical skills which would have gotten him into a much more lucrative career had he allowed them to. He was sort of shy and unassuming, and so he chose what he had been told shy people should do: accounting. He recognized all these problems in his life, and he recognized that they could be annoying. He did not see the connection between those problems and his overwhelming depression. For as logical as he was, he could not shake the idea that things were happening to him and that his choices were only a small part of the equation. He would never describe himself as superstitious, and he would probably laugh at any person who did, but by any definition he was, in a very real sense, superstitious. This was not characterized by the avoidance of black cats or pouring salt over his shoulder, but by the gullibility that was Nathan. He so believed the things he wanted to, whatever that might mean. He totally shed the responsibility of a life wasted and placed it on the universe. This was not the absolute worst, or even the most uncommon of traits, but it happened to manifest in such a way that all causes for problems were deflected away to an unknown place in his consciousness, and had fed a quickly growing paranoia against various members of his family. Everyone was either grace incarnate or a total leech at any given time. There was never any gray area. Needless to say, this made for tempestuous relationships. Luckily, he had begun seeing a therapist, and so all of this was in the past. This ridiculous pity party that he had frequently thrown for himself needed to come to a close. He was getting far too old for that. His therapist was a handsome family friend named Daniel Carr, who was about 20 years older than he, and who insisted on being called by either his first name or Doc. Daniel was the kind of man who was so good-looking he could completely reroute someone's philosophy after an hour of conversation based on their not wanting to disappoint him, which was exactly what had happened to Nathan. Daniel was, of course, straight, but seemed to flirt with him anyway for unknown reasons. Nathan had taken such a liking to Daniel that he had begun fantasizing about him. It wasn't just that he was good-looking, he represented all things adult to him, how to take responsibility and effectively make changes. The two had learned to maintain a kind of tense friendship wherein certain topics of discussion were limited depending on the forum. Mutual friends were not spoken about in the office, and Nathan's inability to cope with stress was off-limits outside of it. It was working surprisingly well, and they found that they both needed it since their circle of friends was dwindling. They would meet for coffee once every week, just to have something to do on a lunch break. Just as sleep had begun to tug on his heavy eyelids, Nathan heard a single, sharp knock that reverberated from his front door all the way down the hall to his eardrums. This made him extremely angry. The only person he thought it could be was his mother, and she would not be welcome in broad daylight, let alone 2 o'clock in the morning. He emerged from his pile of wadded-up flannel sheets and stomped towards the front door of his house. He did not bother looking out the peephole, as that would take too much effort. He figured his mother would be driving home from some vacation with her girlfriends and wanted to stop in and say hello, show off some magnets and shot glasses she'd picked up at a gift shop in some seedy casino. She was always driving back from places at strange hours to avoid traffic. He did love her, but had just, about enough of her showing up whenever she felt like it. He flung open the door, ready to send her away, but it was not his mother. "I'm sorry to show up like this. I'm a little drunk." It was, embarrassingly, Daniel. He had certainly been drinking. The stench of cheap vodka spewed out of his pores in semblance with some spicy, overpriced cologne. That did not make him any less beautiful. The readiness of his tired eyes seemed to suggest a rare sensitivity that was not revealed during office hours. "Here, come in, sit down." Nathan's body began to tingle with a divine urgency. He was excited and mortified by this visit. It had been years since he'd had a house guest that he wasn't related to. "Do you want a glass of water? You probably should drink one." "No." Daniel did not seem in the mood for polite adage. He plopped himself down on a patchy sofa that rested against a wall adjacent to the front door and stared at the space ahead of him, like a child in time out. "What brings you here so late?" As he asked this, Nathan realized just how relevant the question was. Why, of all places, would he come here? The man didn't even drive a car, he rode a bicycle all over town, even though he could absolutely afford a nice car. What on earth could have happened that he felt the need to ride his bike from some watering hole all the way down to Nathan's house? "My heart is..." Daniel lifted his hands, clapped them together, and shredded the air between them as though it were an old parking ticket. This kind of drunken charade was ridiculous, but at the same time endearing. Broken? Nathan was oddly excited by this. His thoughts flurried against one another as he envisioned a scenario where he became Daniel's shoulder to cry on, but was quickly tempered by the perverse thought of dating a therapist his mother had introduced to him. He also knew how horribly insensitive this was. Daniel had never mentioned he was seeing someone before. "Well, do you want to talk about it?" He stared at the room they were in and was suddenly grateful that Daniel had not come over there sober. It wasn't a totally unappealing house, but it had not been dusted or vacuumed in about a year, and despite his tidy professional appearance, he allowed his entire home to become a storage room, filled with boxes with no organization whatsoever. The living room where they sat now was in a much better state than the back of the house. It was at least painted in the last 5 years, a nice cool taupe color. There was a medium-sized television set opposite the sofa with a mirror hanging above it. In front of Daniel there was a small but elaborately carved wood coffee table which he, in his intoxication, decided to use as a footrest. Nathan stared at his beautiful, dark companion. His hair was lightly seasoned with gray strands, not quite aging him, but allowing for a distinguished look. His eyes were deep-set and kind of a hazel gold. He looked like a Greek god. When he stood, he was well over 6 feet with a perfect build. He would be intimidating were it not for his welcoming disposition. Nathan thought about how strange and wonderful these circumstances were. Daniel was a doctored man and barely a friend. He should know better than to breach professional boundaries like this, and yet he had some reason. He had to have gotten Nathan's address from his file or someone they both knew. Finally, Nathan realized he was wearing unflattering plaid pajamas, grabbed himself a robe from the closet, and took a seat in a chair in the far corner of the room. He loved that chair, all sunken in and covered by a quilt his mother had made for him as a child. It even smelled like her. Daniel sat with his face over his hands and as though he was praying. Nathan clutched the arms of his chair, wondering what he could say that would be appropriate, if not comforting. He decided this role reversal was not as much fun as it could be. "She's married," Daniel choked suddenly. He was rubbing the sides of his temples now, likely to start crying at any moment. But this admission had significantly lessened both Nathan's sympathy for and attraction to the wounded old man. Nathan never did approve of infidelity or those who partook in it. "Well, you should know better than to get mixed up in that kind of thing. It never does make for a successful relationship." This was not helpful, but Nathan didn't know how to feel about this revelation. He had been so elated to open the door to this lovely man, and now with this disappointment he felt like telling Daniel to leave so he could go back to bed. I begged her to leave her husband, but she just wouldn't. He was sobbing now. Nathan was not good at this sort of thing. But he could hardly resist a crying friend, so he reached over and embraced him gently, patting his back. Daniel began to slow his breathing down, and after about 10 seconds, which seemed like an eternity, he let him go. Nathan wasn't quite sure if he had extended this gesture for Daniel's benefit or his own. He only knew it felt good to be exposed to some form of direct human contact after years of exclusion from it. "Do you party at all?" Daniel abruptly reached inside his jacket and pulled out an unmarked orange pill bottle. Had it been any other day, Nathan would have refused those pills. He simply would have said no and excused the man for the evening. But now he was very tired and, as always, was extremely lonely. He would give anything to have such a beautiful friend with him that night, and to have some escape from his painfully mundane reality. He had never done drugs in his life, never had anything stronger than a beer. He had never even smoked a cigarette. Sure. He reached out his hand and accepted a tiny, white, innocent little pill into his damp, pink, shaky palm. He assessed the situation for a brief moment. There he was, about to take unknown drugs with this incredibly unbalanced but gorgeous therapist. Could this be the turning point where he would finally start living his life? Could this be the escape from the punishment of the universe? Probably not, but he had nothing to lose. They swallowed the pills dry. Nathan sat back in his favorite chair, wondering what the hell he had just done. "What does it do, Doc?" His voice wavered a little. Daniel looked over at him slyly and said nothing for a few seconds, and then shrugged. Nathan normally couldn't stand the idea of being out of control, but the chance at taking that pill and having that experience with this magnetic person was far too intriguing. He felt a sense of pride in exploring these new sensations, not yet knowing what they were exactly. He sat for a moment, breathing deeply, realizing just how crazy Daniel must be to risk his career with behavior like this. What else is he hiding behind that pretty facade? When did you know you were gay? He resented Daniel's question. He hated being treated like some kind of oddity, but answered it anyway. And sitting with the question for a moment, he vaguely hoped this would segue into Daniel revealing his openness for experimentation. I guess by the time I was 10, I understood I was attracted to other boys. Daniel smiled gleefully at this response. All of these actions were so puzzling to Nathan. Where was the well-rounded man his mother had introduced to him? Was this really the person he had been trusting with his own welfare? Are you attracted to me? Nathan could tell that Daniel was fighting laughter when he asked the question, and couldn't believe he had allowed for this type of thing to happen in his own home. He was fuming. I bet you love guys like me. I can't see you chasing after a bunch of little boys in ladies' clothes. I think it may be time for me to go to bed. You're welcome to stay on the couch, asshole. Nathan rose and headed toward the back of the house, where he could hide from this disastrous evening. Now just wait a minute. I'm making conversation. You're welcome to deflect any time, dear. Daniel beckoned him back to the chair. He turned and sat back down, not because Daniel was so convincing, but because walking those few steps made him realize he really was starting to feel sick. Daniel, I don't feel so well. His heart was pounding now, and his skin felt like it was being prickled with a million tiny needles. His stomach churned almost in rhythm with his quickened pulse. Just let it happen, young man. Daniel was leaning in towards him. He reached over and began firmly massaging his neck and shoulders. The panic was subsiding as quickly as it had risen, and now a slight twinge of euphoria washed over Nathan. He began staring again at his handsome friend and felt an ease that comes from the familiarity of a face. It was amazing how fast the anger had left him. All that mattered now was this wonderful person had helped calm his unsteady nerves. You really are so beautiful. The words spilled out of Nathan's mouth like warm molasses. Daniel drew nearer to him, so much so that they could feel the impact of the other's breath on their rosy cheeks. He no longer smelled like alcohol. His cologne had dispersed into a mild, woody fragrance and now blended with the sweet sourness of body odor. Nathan's thoughts were becoming fuzzy. He tried thinking of clever things to say, but it was too difficult to string a cohesive sentence together. So in a rare moment of bravery, he leaned in and kissed Daniel. It was soft and lasted no time at all, as though they were small children taking dares in a sandbox. But the kiss was so delicious to Nathan that it rippled all over his body and caused him to keel over onto the floor in front of him. He started to laugh, a loud, embarrassing, almost guttural laugh. He seemed to laugh for hours before tiring and rolling over on his side to see his friend staring blankly at the floor. What's wrong, Doc? He followed a path from Daniel's eyes to their focal point to the left of him. He was afraid he had noticed an old stain on the carpet. It was a small wallet-sized picture of Nathan's mother, Sandy, that had somehow dropped. The picture was an older one than that Nathan hadn't seen a copy of in years. Her hair hadn't been that color in at least a decade. He glanced back at Daniel, who was tearing up. It took Nathan a few still seconds to piece things together. He sat up against the coffee table, clasped his hands together, and just rested with his realization. How could you? I don't know. Daniel answered solemnly. He began rubbing his face again, this time more furiously. Nathan tried again to make sense of what he was feeling. It was a violation. It was completely disgusting, and it was very hurtful. It seemed unnatural that a man so attractive, a man who had displayed such kindness with him, should get to parade his charm in front of him only to reveal such a horrid betrayal. This same man had analyzed his innermost feelings and found it acceptable to molest them further. The effects of the mystery drug were accelerating, now in conjunction with a growing, lustful anger. Nathan quickly jumped to his feet and darted toward the kitchen. Once in the kitchen, he paused, trying to understand what he was doing in this rage. Nothing was made quite clear, but the feeling that Daniel must be hurt badly. He had caused Nathan such extreme pain and embarrassment that those few seconds that it could only be justified by total ruin, by blood. He grabbed a large kitchen knife from a wooden holder, wrapped it in a hand towel and put it in his pocket, then headed back towards the living room to see what his unwelcome guest was up to. He had disappeared. Nathan went outside and scanned the area around the house. He could hardly see, but he could hear shuffling in the grass ahead of him, so he followed it. As he forged ahead, he thought of his mother and the man he had just kissed in a warm embrace. It was beyond despicable. Daniel must have been using him to get closer to his mother. It was the only logical explanation. Why else would he show up there so late at night without calling? How dare he come in and take what he wants from me? Tell me I'm crazy, flirt with me, tease me, give me drugs, all the while dreaming about my very own mother. Sick bastard needs a lesson. And I will give it to him. For once in my life, I will get revenge on a prick that has done me wrong. Tonight's the night. Tonight is when it all changes, forever changed. Nathan, said a woman's voice. He stopped in his tracks, expecting a neighbor to come out of the darkness to talk to him. But he couldn't see anyone or anything. He kept going, deciding that rat Daniel must be up in the hills behind the house. He was worried about who it was calling him, but not worried enough to stop a search. He was getting deeper and deeper into the forest until finally he decided to stop. He was far enough in the hills that the stars in the sky had brightened. Had he passed him? Then he heard a busy rustling again. There you are. I'm glad you found me. I just remembered there was supposed to be a meteorite shower tonight. Come up here, get a better view. He had found Daniel amongst the trees, but was suddenly unable to perform the desired task. He walked over to where Daniel stood. You could have the decency to tell me you were leaving, he muttered. I could have, but it's more fun this way. Daniel scratched his chin quizzically as he thought about his statement like a riddle. He was still a bit drunk. The two men sat on the cold, damp ground and stared up at the sky, waiting for something to happen, not speaking. Nathan's thinking had cleared a bit, and he was beginning to wonder if he had reacted too brashly. His mother could be a very manipulative person, and she was the one who was cheating, not Daniel. It's those drugs. I'm not a bad person. It's those drugs. What exactly was in those little white pills we took? Daniel stared silently, as he did so well, avoiding the question completely. I can't wait for this meteorite shower. It's been so long since I've seen one. I used to want to be an astronomer, he finally answered. Nathan wondered why it had to be this way, why someone so amazing and beautiful and perfect, someone who had been given to him on a silver platter, had to be the one that had done something awful like that. How can you be such a free spirit and expect to be taken seriously? Nathan wanted to be indulged in his presence for a while longer. The torture of his was he wanted to know more about this increasingly twisted, beautiful being, despite the obvious betrayal. I've managed to keep the two worlds separate, Daniel whispered. What a liar. Nathan was halfway between wanting to cut him and wanting to relive that kiss they shared in the living room. I was so hung up on this woman, Daniel started in with rubbing his face again. He had played poker, or if he had played poker, this would have been his big tell. It's the first time in my life I've ever loved a woman my own age. She was such a trip, you don't even know. Why are you referring to her as this woman? Daniel continued to ignore Nathan's questions. They were either not important or too revealing. Nathan couldn't decide. The sex was incredible, I have to say. We were like magnets. Nathan could feel the anger immediately rise up in him, and this time it would not subside. It was an uncontrollable sort of rage that would not respond to reason. It was primal, and there was only one way to pacify it. This was it. No conscious thought, just a cool burn of adrenaline plunging him toward one goal. He plunged the knife into Daniel's side. He paused, watching the man's reaction to his attack. Daniel kept still for a second and then slowly brought his hands to his side and opened his mouth, posed to speak, but said nothing. Only frowned, exhaled shakily, clearly in shock. Nathan instantly felt powerful, and a kind of contentedness displaced his latent anxieties. The contentedness grew into pure joy, like nothing he had before. This was the kind of happiness he had been waiting for all his miserable life. This was the ecstasy people wrote about. This was much better than that kiss. This was justice. It was an act of God. He was God. He took hold of the knife, pulling it out of the man's side, seeing the dark fluid expand from its point of origin over a pristine white button-down. He then stabbed Daniel again, this time in the chest, hitting bone and adding to the sense of accomplishment. Daniel slumped over, his eyes flickering like sparklers. Daniel looked up into the sky, just in time to see the shooting stars skimming the black and blue. The bright flames seemed to arch in perfect harmony with one another. Observant parishioners against stationary stairs, waiting, failing to hide from everyone in the darkness of the night. His eyes traced the glowing stars down to the trunk of a nearby pine, and then planted his gaze on the man he had just released from this world. He drew upon his methodical nature and didn't waste any time being shocked. He dashed back to the house to retrieve a shovel. He still felt high from the kill and didn't let physical fatigue impede him. He saw Daniel's bike sitting out by the front stoop and clumsily clicked it down so it wouldn't catch any eyes, planning to come back to it later. He continued an exhaustive half-jog back to the place where Daniel's limp body lay and began digging into the soaked earth. He was not an especially strong man, but he was a determined one, and he was on top of the world. In less than an hour, he had managed to dig a hole that could contain Daniel's bloody corpse. Before putting the body in the ground, he stood, covered in sweat, and filled with awe at what he had done. It was like a masterpiece. Daniel's body looked just as it did in life, but was made more beautiful by its wounds. I need to cover up this dog. No one will ever find him. No one will ever know. When the body had been covered, it was nearly 6 o'clock. The sun was rising, bleeding bright red and oranges into the spaces between branches. Nathan was genuinely tired. He trekked back to the house, feeling numb and exhausted, but with a lingering sense of pride at his achievements. He was happy. Fear and remorse were of no consequence at that hour, only the bliss of having been in control and experienced triumph over one's enemy. Once he reached the house, he collapsed on the sofa and fell right to sleep, peaceful, childlike. Nathan was again awoken by a knock at the door. He grudgingly opened his eyes. He had slept late. He was back in his bed, and judging by the light, it was almost noon. Then he felt fear set in. Unlike other times, he could vividly remember all the details of this nightmare. What a horrible dream. He felt such relief at knowing he was back to reality. There would be no guilt, no punishment for such a heinous act. He heard another knock at the door. He knew that that his car was parked out front, so there was no pretending to be gone. He would have to answer it and deal with a Jehovah's Witness or however. He walked toward the door and peered out the peephole. It was his mother, of course. A million sparks bounced back and forth in the space between his ears as he thought of things he might say to her. Should he confront her? No, he mustn't make accusations based on an absurd dream. He wasn't sure what was real. Perhaps the first half of the dream had happened and the effects of the drugs were responsible for the rest. Perhaps Daniel had been there and left before he woke up. What he knew for sure was he was not capable of murder. So without hesitation, he opened the door. My God, Nathan, there you are. He tried to answer, but was interrupted as usual. Listen, there's been an emergency. Apparently Daniel Carr had some kind of fight with his girlfriend last night and he didn't show up to work today. His mother called me in hysterics. He's not answering his phone either. Do you know where he is? What kind of mind game was she playing? Daniel has a girlfriend? Well, yes, it's all very hushed. It's one of his married office partners' wives. I'm surprised your sister hasn't told you about it. Honey, what is all that blood on your shirt?